civilians to history has witnessed countless tragedies that shook humanity to its core. A single wrong decision, an overlooked technical detail, or even a misunderstood radio call can turn an ordinary event into a catastrophe that claims hundreds of lives. In today's video, we'll revisit some of those stories. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Number 1. Saudia Flight 163. On the 19th of August, 1980, an in-flight emergency forced Saudia Flight 163 to make an emergency landing at Riyadh International Airport. Yet, despite what appeared to be a successful touchdown, not a single soul aboard the aircraft survived. The flight was operated by a crew of 3. Captain Mohammed Kawader was a pilot with more than 7,000 flight hours, though his record suggested he was a slow learner who had required more training time than most of his peers. First Officer Sami Abdullah Hassanain was not truly proficient with this type of aircraft and had once been dismissed from flight school for poor performance before eventually securing his license. Flight engineer Bradley Curtis had failed his upgrade attempt to first officer and had been forced to pay out of his own pocket just to retain his position. Although none of the 3 carried particularly impressive resumes, each was technically qualified and had passed the necessary checks. The initial leg of the journey went smoothly. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar departed Quaid-e-Azam International Airport in Pakistan at 6:32 in the evening local time. Passengers enjoyed an uneventful flight into Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where they were scheduled for a 2-hour stopover. During this period, all passengers disembarked while the aircraft was serviced and refueled. Those continuing on to the final destination of Jeddah reboarded soon afterward. Shortly after takeoff, however, the cockpit contacted air traffic control to declare an emergency return to Riyadh, requesting that fire trucks be made ready. Controllers immediately cleared the runway. The aircraft circled back and touched down in front of waiting rescue crews. Observers assumed the jet would stop right there. Instead, it continued to slow gradually, turned onto a taxiway, and executed a precise 180-degree turn. Only then did Captain Kawader announce that he was initiating an evacuation. Rescue teams rushed to the aircraft, prepared to assist, but no passengers emerged. Smoke began seeping from the fuselage, followed swiftly by flames. Despite the best efforts of firefighters, the jet was soon engulfed. All exits remained closed, and no one managed to escape. On board were 301 people, 287 passengers, and 14 crew members. Many of those passengers had been on a pilgrimage, with entire families perishing on what was meant to be the most sacred journey of their lives. Investigators were faced with 2 pressing questions. What had ignited the fire on board, and why had the captain failed to stop immediately and evacuate upon landing? The origin of the blaze proved difficult to pinpoint. Although the inquiry could not produce a definitive conclusion, it determined that the fire had started in the aft cargo hold. The exact source was likely destroyed in the flames, but suspicion fell upon a piece of passenger luggage. Investigators discovered 2 butane camp stoves in the wreckage, though it could not be proven that they were responsible. Cockpit voice recordings revealed that once the fire began, the crew committed a series of errors, their exchanges muddled and confused, each mistake costing them precious, irreplaceable minutes. From the very beginning, the crew recognized trouble when the smoke warning in the cargo hold was activated. Yet instead of treating it as an immediate emergency, they spent nearly 5 minutes debating. The captain seemed hesitant to make a decision and turned instead to the far less experienced flight engineer. After this exchange, Flight Engineer Curtis attempted to look up the proper checklist. Unfortunately, he consulted the wrong section of the manual. Convinced that no relevant procedure existed, Curtis then spent additional time checking the smoke detectors themselves to see if they might be faulty. In doing so, he inadvertently introduced fresh oxygen into the compartment, which only served to intensify the blaze. Moments later, he suggested returning to the passenger cabin to verify the presence of smoke firsthand. Only when Curtis came back and confirmed that there was indeed a fire on board was the decision finally made to turn back toward Riyadh. The cockpit atmosphere during the return was chaotic. Captain Kawader repeatedly asked for instructions to be repeated, unable to catch them the first time. 2 flight attendants entered in turn, reporting smoke and fire in the cabin, and later warning that passengers were panicking and crowding the aisles. At times, the voice recorder captured Captain Kawader humming a tune, while Curtis kept repeating the phrase, "Everything will be fine." Perhaps both men were trying to remain calm, but the effect only heightened the tension. In such circumstances, several critical decisions were never made. Flight attendants asked multiple times whether passengers should be evacuated immediately after landing, but the captain gave no clear answer. Precious minutes were wasted on tasks of little importance. During the emergency landing procedures, the crew lost time switching on the no smoking sign and repeating checklist items that had already been completed, while failing to prioritize the essentials. These missteps delayed the response significantly, but the gravest mistake was the captain's failure to execute a full stop and order an evacuation the moment the aircraft touched down. By this stage, the cockpit voice recorder had ceased operating. Still, after completing a precise 180-degree turn, Captain Cowder informed the tower that he was beginning evacuation. This suggested he still believed he had control of the situation. Later analysis confirmed the braking system was more than capable of bringing the aircraft to a halt much earlier, but instead he chose to decelerate gradually and taxi off the runway. Compounding the problem, the crew failed to depressurize the cabin upon landing, which left the doors impossible to open from the outside. A common theory is that the captain did not fully appreciate the severity of the fire, perhaps concerned about blocking the runway, or convinced that a more orderly evacuation could be carried out after taxiing clear. Another possibility is that by keeping the engines running while taxiing, he hoped the airflow would draw smoke out of the cabin. In practice, this did not occur. By the time evacuation was attempted, the fire had grown ferociously, and flashover swept through the cabin almost instantly, filling it with flames and toxic smoke. The official report concluded that in less than 30 seconds, deadly fumes had spread throughout the cabin, causing the deaths of everyone on board. The crew's indecision and mishandling were harshly criticized, yet no individual was ever held accountable, for there were no survivors of Saudia Flight 163. Number 2. The crash of United Flight 232. On the 19th of July, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 departed on what was meant to be a routine journey from Stapleton International Airport in Denver to O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, with a final leg to Philadelphia International Airport. Yet Flight 232 would never reach its ultimate destination. United Airlines, headquartered in the United States, had been operating continuously since 1931. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the airline was a popular choice, particularly for shorter cross-country routes. Though not the largest carrier, United remained well regarded within the industry. The aircraft assigned to operate Flight 232 that day was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, tail number N1819U. At 18 years of age, it had accumulated more than 43,401 flight hours, neither brand new nor yet at the end of its service life. The crew on board were professionals with varying levels of experience. Captain Alfred Haynes, age 57, had joined United in 1956 and logged more than 7,000 hours in the DC-10. First Officer William Records, 48 years old, had begun his career with National Airlines in 1969, later flying for Pan American before joining United in 1985. He had roughly 600 hours of experience in the DC-10. Flight engineer Dudley Dvorak, age 51, had been hired by United in 1986 and had logged only 33 hours on the type. In addition to the cockpit crew, there were 8 flight attendants and a total of 285 passengers, many of them traveling with young children on their laps. At the time, United was running a Children's Day promotion whereby children under the age of 14 could fly with an accompanying adult for just a penny. Many families took advantage of this offer, setting out for vacation destinations at unprecedentedly low fares. At 2:09 in the afternoon, Flight 232 lifted off from Denver and climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude. The DC-10 leveled off at 37,000 feet, approximately 11,277 meters, and remained there for about 1 hour. The flight proceeded exactly as scheduled until 3:16 p.m., when a violent shudder shook the aircraft. A loud bang followed instantly. The autopilot disengaged at once, and Captain Haynes saw warning indicators showing that engine number 2 had failed. He attempted to reduce power, only to discover that the throttles were jammed. The crew managed to shut the engine down completely, but in doing so, they realized the control columns no longer responded. Flight engineer Dvorak checked the systems and found that all hydraulics, the lifeblood of the aircraft's controls, had been completely depleted. Every attempt to restore them with auxiliary power failed. The DC-10 fell into a phugoid cycle, its nose pitching up and down in a wave-like motion, while simultaneously banking further and further to the right. The crew could find no checklist, no established procedure to counter the unfolding disaster. Even a desperate call to United's maintenance base yielded no solution. In a rare stroke of fortune, Denny Fitch, a 46-year-old DC-10 flight instructor, happened to be on board as a passenger. He immediately recognized the rolling oscillations the plane was experiencing. Since becoming an instructor, Fitch had studied the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123, which had occurred just 4 years earlier. That flight, too, had lost all hydraulics and fallen into a similar fugoid cycle before ending in tragedy. After speaking through a flight attendant, Fitch was escorted to the cockpit. There, working alongside the crew, he helped quickly determine what the aircraft could and could not do. They discovered that by modulating thrust on the remaining engines, they could at least influence the plane's heading to the right. At the same time, they could alter pitch to counteract the fugoid oscillations. Captain Haynes asked Fitch to manage the throttles so he himself could focus on the control column. Despite the life-threatening circumstances, the crew maintained composure and even relieved the tension with moments of humor. Fitch was recorded saying, "I'll tell you what, when this is all over, we'll have a beer." To which Captain Haynes replied, "I don't drink, but I'll sure as hell have one this time." Working together, they guided the crippled DC-10 towards Sioux Gateway Airport. As they did, Haynes requested that air traffic controllers keep the aircraft well clear of the city, a clear indication that, despite his calm demeanor, he fully grasped the gravity of their situation. As Flight 232 prepared to land, one final adjustment was required. Unable to align with runway 31 as planned, the crew diverted to runway 22, the very strip where fire and rescue units had gathered. Those vehicles scrambled out of the way as the DC-10 approached at a speed far beyond safe limits. Moments before touchdown, the aircraft rolled sharply to the right. The crew applied extra thrust on the port engines to counter the bank. But it was too late. The right wing struck the ground and broke away as the fuselage slammed down. The jet disintegrated, spilling fuel that ignited into a fireball. The aircraft shattered into pieces, flames consuming the wreckage. Only the cockpit and tail sections remained relatively intact, coming to rest in a cornfield adjacent to the airport. Even with fire crews already on scene, the inferno raged for more than 5 hours. The destruction was so violent that first responders doubted anyone had survived, but astonishingly, many had. 185 people lived through the disaster, though one later succumbed to injuries. Not only did numerous passengers escape, but some even re-entered the wreckage to help others. Passenger Jerry Schemmel, for example, lost a friend in the crash but managed to free himself, then went back inside the burning fuselage to rescue an 11-month-old child. Still, the tragedy claimed 112 lives. The investigation into Flight 232 was swift, yet complex. Focus fell on the number 2 engine, whose critical fan disc fragments were missing from the crash site. Manufacturer General Electric posted a reward for their recovery, and 3 months later, a farmer discovered the parts in her field. Tests revealed that the fan disc had been defective from its manufacture in 1971. The steel contained an impurity that led to gradual fatigue, eventually fracturing mid-flight. United Airlines maintenance procedures should have caught the flaw earlier, but at the time, inspections paid little attention to such cracks. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that when the disc failed, it exploded with immense force, destroying not only the engine but also damaging the tail, rear elevators, and the hydraulic systems, explaining why the crew had lost all primary control. The findings prompted sweeping changes across aviation. New aircraft designs incorporated upgraded hydraulics to prevent total loss of control, and United revised its maintenance protocols. The ordeal of Flight 232 also became a defining case study in crew resource management. Indeed, the crew worked together so effectively that when test pilots attempted to replicate the scenario in simulators, none matched or exceeded their performance. The United crew was praised for carrying out what many called an impossible landing. Captain Haynes received awards and wide recognition, though he always insisted the credit belonged equally to his colleagues, all of whom survived with serious injuries. In the years that followed, Haynes became a respected speaker on aviation safety, recounting the events of that day to audiences around the world. A memorial was later erected for those who perished. United's DC-10s remained in service for years until their retirement in 2001. Though the crash of Flight 232 cost many lives, Without the extraordinary teamwork, ingenuity, and calm determination of the crew, the outcome would have been far more catastrophic. Number 3. The story of Flight 5390. On the 10th of June, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 was en route to Spain when, without warning, 2 of the 6 cockpit windows blew out. In most circumstances, such a failure would all but guarantee catastrophe. Yet in this case, what followed became one of aviation's most extraordinary exceptions. The flight began without incident. Departing from Birmingham Airport, its destination was Malaga, Spain. The weather that day was clear. At the controls was Captain Tim Lancaster, a pilot with 11,000 hours of experience, alongside First Officer Alastair Acheson, who had logged 7,900 hours. Although the 2 men had never flown together before, they quickly developed an easy coordination, lifting the aircraft into the sky without difficulty. On board were 84 passengers and 6 cabin crew, all expecting nothing more than a routine journey. Once airborne, Captain Lancaster engaged the autopilot and loosened his shoulder harness for comfort. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden entered the cockpit to take the pilot's breakfast orders, promising to return shortly with 2 cups of hot tea. Everything seemed normal. And then, disaster struck. One of the cockpit windows suddenly shattered outward, disappearing into the rushing slipstream and leaving a gaping void in its place. The sudden change in pressure was violent. The cockpit door was torn off its hinges, and Captain Lancaster was wrenched from his seat, sucked headlong toward the opening. Only his legs remained inside, trapped against the controls, while the rest of his body was flung outward and slammed against the fuselage by the roaring wind. At that moment, Ogden, still standing near the cockpit doorway, staggered inside, stunned by the explosion. What he saw was chaos. The captain suspended outside the shattered window, his legs wedged against the console, while First Officer Acheson struggled desperately to regain control. The cockpit filled with mist and the deafening howl of rushing air. Without hesitation, Ogden lunged forward, seized Lancaster's legs, and held on with all his strength. Acheson now faced the near-impossible task of flying under brutal conditions. The cockpit opened to the sky, sub-zero air pouring in, and the wind so loud that radio transmissions were inaudible. Worse still, Lancaster's body remained jammed against the controls, making it nearly impossible to stabilize the aircraft. 2 more flight attendants soon rushed in to help. One looped her arm through a seatbelt, allowing Ogden to reposition Lancaster's legs clear of the flight controls. Freed from this obstruction, Acheson finally managed to pull the DC-9 out of its steep dive. He leveled off just long enough to descend into an altitude band where passengers could breathe without oxygen masks. Even then, danger lingered. The jet had blundered through crowded airspace, narrowly avoiding collisions, and Lancaster himself remained in peril. If he slipped free, he would not only be lost but could also be sucked into the engine, threatening everyone on board. Thinking quickly, another flight attendant lashed his legs to a jump seat, securing him in place. Though they could not bring him back inside, they could at least prevent him from being carried away. With the aircraft at last stable, Acheson began to hear faint radio transmissions. He declared an emergency and requested the nearest possible diversion. Air traffic control directed him to Southampton Airport, a field where he had never landed before. But now his only option. Though under enormous pressure, Acheson remained calm, worked closely with controllers, and against all odds executed a near-perfect landing at Southampton. Rescue teams were already waiting as Flight 5390 touched down. The shaken passengers were quickly escorted from the aircraft, while medical personnel and crew members hauled Captain Lancaster back into the cockpit and began resuscitation efforts. At that moment, most assumed he was beyond saving. His ordeal had been too severe. Yet, against all expectation, he was alive. Lancaster had suffered multiple fractures, countless lacerations, and severe frostbite across much of his body. Even so, within only a few days, he was speaking to the press from his hospital bed. With the immediate crisis over, investigators turned to the question that now demanded an answer. What had caused the cockpit window to detach in midair? The missing pane was recovered in a field in Oxfordshire, and both it and the aircraft were examined in detail. The truth emerged quickly. The windshield had been secured with bolts of the wrong size. Roughly 90 bolts had been used in the most recent maintenance, of which 84 were smaller than required. The difference between the installed bolts and the correct specification was less than the width of a credit card, a discrepancy that would have been nearly impossible to notice without painstaking inspection. So how had such a mistake occurred? Attention focused on the maintenance engineer who had replaced the window. Questioning revealed a chain of small but critical errors. When the aircraft came under his care, the windshield was already fastened with incorrect bolts. Instead of consulting the technical manual, he simply chose to install replacements that looked the same. He relied on a visual comparison between old and new bolts, never cross-checking part numbers. As a result, he replaced one set of incorrect bolts with another set that was equally unfit. He ignored written guidance, brushed aside a colleague's advice, and no second inspection was carried out when the work was finished. Though the new bolts appeared nearly identical, even the smallest differences in length and width created a fatal weakness that all but guaranteed failure. In the aftermath, British Airways tightened its engineering protocols, and the incident became a case study for mechanics across the aviation industry. Every aircraft of the same type was inspected, and at least 2 others were found to have windscreens installed with bolts of the wrong size. Number 4. The Tenerife Airport Disaster. On the 27th of March, 1977, one of the deadliest catastrophes in aviation history unfolded at Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife. 2 fully loaded Boeing 747s collided on the runway, producing a tragedy without precedent, one that was ultimately traced to nothing more than a series of communication errors. The day of the disaster was an unusually busy one at Los Rodeos. Normally, the small island airport operated with a single runway and a single parallel taxiway, handling only a modest number of flights and rarely accommodating aircraft of such size. But on that day, chaos descended after multiple inbound flights were diverted from Gando Airport on nearby Gran Canaria, which had been closed following the detonation of a small bomb inside a terminal flower shop. Among the diverted flights were KLM 4805 from Amsterdam and Pan American 1736 from Los Angeles. Both had been bound for Gran Canaria but were forced instead to land at Los Rodeos. The situation quickly grew untenable. The taxiways became so congested with parked aircraft that there was no space left for movement. As a result, every departing plane was forced to taxi along the runway itself, adding dangerous complexity for the small control tower staff, who were accustomed to managing only a handful of operations at a time. Compounding matters, it was a Sunday, and only 2 controllers were on duty. With no ground radar available, they relied entirely on line of sight and radio communications. As the day wore on, a dense fog descended, further obscuring visibility. Controllers could no longer see the aircraft they were directing, and pilots could barely make out the runway or signage beneath them. Delays mounted as confusion deepened. For the passengers, the waiting was miserable. The cramped terminal offered little relief, and many were uncertain how long they would be stranded. Passengers aboard Pan Am 1736 remained stuck on their aircraft in stifling heat, as there was virtually no space left inside the terminal. By contrast, one woman traveling aboard the KLM flight was spared the ordeal altogether. A Tenerife resident, she disembarked when the flight first landed, choosing to go home rather than sit through the delay, an ordinary decision that, unbeknownst to her, saved her life. For the majority, however, most of them tourists, there was no choice but to wait. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, word finally came that Gran Canaria had been declared safe and reopened. Passengers reboarded, crews prepared for departure, and as the traffic jam began to ease, the KLM aircraft was instructed to taxi to the far end of the runway in preparation for takeoff. At the same time, the Pan Am flight was directed to follow the runway and exit via the 3rd taxiway. But that was easier said than done. In the thick fog and unfamiliar environment, the Pan Am crew missed the assigned exit and continued crawling toward the 4th. What this meant, in stark terms, was that the 2 massive Boeing 747s were now aligned nose to nose on the same stretch of tarmac, separated only by a wall of fog. At the far end, the KLM aircraft stood ready to begin its takeoff roll. At the near end, the Pan Am aircraft continued lumbering forward in search of its exit. From the cockpit of the KLM jet, Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten strained his eyes into the blinding white fog. Concerned that the crew's duty hours were about to exceed regulations, Captain Van Zanten grew impatient to depart. He even released the brakes, allowing the aircraft to begin rolling forward without clearance from the tower. At that moment, the first officer quickly reminded him that they had not yet been given permission to take off. Van Zanten reluctantly stopped and remarked, "No, I know. Keep going. Ask." The first officer radioed air traffic control. The controller responded with instructions describing the route the KLM would take after departure. But critically, no clearance to take off was granted. The first officer repeated the instructions back, ending with the phrase, "We are now at takeoff." The tower replied, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." At that very instant, the Pan Am aircraft, still taxiing down the runway, cut into the transmission to remind the tower that they had not yet vacated. The two radio signals overlapped, creating interference that garbled most of the exchange, leaving only one word audible: "Okay." That single word was all that reached the KLM cockpit, and Captain Van Zanten misinterpreted it as clearance to depart. He advanced the throttles, and the jet surged down the runway. Even as the aircraft gathered speed, hesitation lingered on the flight deck. The flight engineer spoke up, questioning the captain. "Are you sure Pan American is clear of the runway?" Captain Jacob Veldhuizen Van Zanten replied curtly, "Yes," and pressed on with the takeoff roll. If the others harbored doubts, none voiced them. Van Zanten was a veteran with more than 10,000 flight hours, and no one on the crew wished to challenge his authority as the massive jet accelerated into the fog. The Pan American pilots caught sight of the KLM hurtling toward them only moments before impact. They managed to swerve partially, but the collision could not be avoided. For his part, Van Zanten attempted an early liftoff, hoping to clear the Pan Am, but the maneuver failed. The KLM plowed into the Pan American jet, then crashed back onto the runway, exploding into a colossal fireball. The Pan Am also erupted in flames, though 61 people managed to survive, many by leaping from the wings, suffering terrible injuries in the process. In this disaster, survivors were the exception, not the rule. 583 lives were lost, including everyone aboard the KLM flight. The inferno raged across the runway for hours before it was finally subdued. In the aftermath, multiple investigations were launched, all of which concluded that human factors had been decisive. Captain Van Zanten's impatience, combined with the crew's reluctance to challenge him, was compounded by miscommunication over the radio. In the end, KLM accepted responsibility and compensated the families of the victims. One of the most significant reforms following the tragedy was the standardization of aviation phraseology. Ambiguous terms such as "okay" were banned. Instead, clear, precise readbacks became mandatory, and the word takeoff was prohibited unless explicit clearance to depart had been issued. Cockpit hierarchy was also restructured. The industry began promoting a collaborative environment in which first officers and flight engineers were not only permitted but required to speak up when something seemed amiss, and captains were obligated to listen and respond to those concerns. In the years that followed, memorials were erected around the world in honor of the victims. The tragedy erased entire families, tore friendships apart, and shattered countless peaceful lives in an instant. And all of it need never have happened, if not for a few impatient seconds and a single garbled radio call. Number 5. The Ramstein Air Show disaster. On August 28, 1988, an estimated 300,000 spectators gathered at the American Ramstein Air Base in Germany to watch an aerial display by the Italian Air Force. What began as a spectacle of precision and pageantry soon descended into the deadliest airshow disaster in history at that time. Yet what is most telling is not only the collision itself, but the way both American and German authorities responded in its aftermath. In the wake of the Second World War, the United States resolved to strengthen its air defenses across Europe, wary of mounting tensions with the Soviet Union. Vulnerable fighter units needed to be repositioned farther from East Germany. As part of NATO's expansion program, France agreed to provide land within its occupied zone of West Germany, in the state of Rhineland-Pfalz. Construction of Ramstein Air Base began in April of 1948 near the city of Kaiserslautern and was formally activated on June 1, 1953. The sprawling complex stretched across more than 3,000 acres, encompassing family housing, a headquarters, schools, a cinema, administrative offices, and even a military commissary. Initially, it consisted of two separate facilities, Ramstein Air Station and Landstuhl Air Base. When the German government later built the A6 Autobahn, slicing across Landstuhl's main entrance, the two were merged into a single installation. This was widely regarded as an early sign of miscommunication between German and American authorities. Meanwhile, in 1961, the Italian Air Force formed a dedicated squadron to serve as the nation's official demonstration team, the Pattuglia Acrobatica Nazionale Frecce Tricolori. They replaced informal teams that had been flying since the 1930s and soon became the largest aerobatic unit in the world. A signature feature of their performances was the green, white, and red smoke trails, of colors of the Italian flag. The name Tricolori, or Three Colors, was a deliberate tribute to that banner. Only the most exceptional aviators, each with more than 1,000 flight hours, were selected to join their ranks. Despite their ceremonial mission, the dangers were considerable. Within just 6 months of formation, 4 crashes had already claimed 2 lives. Among their most celebrated routines was the pierced heart. In this maneuver, 2 formations swept toward each other to sketch the outline of a heart in the sky, while a lone jet would dive through the center. On Sunday afternoon, August 28, 1988, the immense crowd at Ramstein watched eagerly as the Frecce Tricolori took to the air. Air shows had become the primary fundraising events for the base, with some stationed units even manning ice cream trucks that day to collect donations from the spectators. Conditions were ideal, clear skies and bright sunshine. The team executed intricate maneuvers to thunderous applause, building anticipation for the finale, the pierced heart. At first, the routine unfolded flawlessly. 2 groups of aircraft converged to complete the heart shape overhead, drawing together at its lowest point at precisely 3:44 in the afternoon. But the jet designated Pony 10, the one meant to pierce the heart, approached too low and too fast. The backspice problig lay Jane Bravoses, end of 2010. Mike Air Commons O Loses, end of 2010. Mike Erx's, end of 2010. On 12. Before the 2 formations could clear one another, Pony 10 slammed into them at tremendous speed, a mere 145 feet above the ground. 3 planes collided. Pony 10 crashed onto the runway and erupted in a massive fireball, showering burning fuel and fragments into the crowd. Much of the wreckage struck a refrigerated ice cream truck. Another aircraft, struck by Pony 10, plummeted into a parked medical helicopter on the field. The third disintegrated in mid-air, scattering debris over the spectators below. A handful of jets narrowly escaped the chaos, quickly regrouped, and flew off toward Sembach Air Base, some 30 kilometers away. On the ground, however, the scene had already collapsed into pandemonium. The crowd was struck by falling wreckage, killing 28 people instantly. 2 of the 3 pilots involved perished upon impact. The remaining aviator managed to eject, but when his parachute failed to deploy, he was killed on the ground. Within only 2 minutes of the collision, American fire crews and ambulances had reached the scene. It quickly became apparent, however, that the American vehicles lacked the medical equipment to cope with a disaster of this scale. Urgent calls went out for German assistance, but when their ambulances arrived, they were held up at the gates of the base. Because German rescue units were not authorized to enter, valuable time was lost before permission was finally granted for them to tend to the wounded. German medical helicopters began landing at 4 to 10 in the afternoon, yet it was nearly an hour after the crash before sufficient ambulances reached the site to deal with the injured. A physician who was present later recalled, "We were searching for burn victims, but the Americans were dragging them away without medical support. Not all casualties were being taken by helicopter or ambulance. The scene was sheer chaos. Some wounded were carried off in pickup trucks, driving alongside departing visitors, rather than through any designated emergency exit. The disorder extended well beyond the runway. Even an hour after the crash, German authorities still lacked a clear picture of the catastrophe. A medic on site later testified, "There was no commanding officer, no executive director, not even a liaison. I asked whether any medical officer had been assigned to coordinate evacuation, but there was no one. Many patients were removed from the base by American soldiers using wooden planks in place of stretchers, loading them onto trucks and other vehicles rather than waiting for ambulances. This method hastened evacuation, but it meant the victims received no medical care en route. Nearby hospitals, having received little advance information, were unable to prepare for the flood of severely injured." A German medic later described arriving at a facility in Landstuhl. The severely burned were lying on wooden boards with no medical personnel attending to them. After helping one victim and handing her over to a hospital nurse from the same flight, I went on to treat others at the military hospital's helipad, and I did not see a single American medic there. By 6:30 that evening, a bus crammed with casualties, including many with severe burns, finally reached a hospital in Ludwigshafen, some 50 miles from the crash site. On board was no medic, only a non-German-speaking driver who had spent hours struggling to locate the facility. In total, 67 spectators and 3 pilots were killed, with roughly 500 more hospitalized. In the aftermath, public scrutiny fell not only on the direct cause of the disaster but also on the chaotic response that followed. Investigations revealed that, for much of the crisis, it was unclear who was in command. Communication proved woefully inadequate, at times relying on amateur radio operators in attendance to relay urgent messages. American forces prioritized the removal of victims over on-site treatment. Air shows across Europe were swiftly canceled, and it would be 3 years before another event of comparable scale was held in Germany. During that interval, new regulations were enacted. Minimum distances between display areas and spectators were substantially increased, and maneuvers directed toward crowds were banned outright. Thanks to these reforms, European air shows today are considerably safer than they were before the tragedy at Ramstein. Number 6. The Texas City Disaster. On April 16, 1947, a small fire broke out aboard the French-flagged cargo ship SS Grand Camp while it was moored in the harbor at Texas City. What at first seemed a minor blaze would ignite a chain reaction of fires spanning 2 days, culminating in the deadliest industrial disaster in American history, and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. Texas City sits on the Texas coastline at the mouth of Galveston Bay, one of the nation's most vital shipping hubs. Established in 1893, the port quickly grew into a magnet for industry. Its fortunes swelled in 1900 as massive vessels carried waves of new commerce, propelling the city into an economic boom. In the decades that followed, Texas City expanded steadily, emerging as a true international port in the years leading up to the Second World War. Ships from Britain, France, and Germany were frequent callers, while new storage tanks and warehouses rose to meet rising demand. The port even boasted its own grain, elevator, and power plant. By 1941, Union Carbide had built a chemical plant along the waterfront, reflecting the transition from traditional commodities like cotton and grain to petroleum and chemical products. During the war, the U.S. government relied heavily on the port, further fueling the prosperity of the region. When the conflict ended, much of Europe lay in ruins. To aid reconstruction, Washington transferred surplus vessels abroad. Among them was the SS Benjamin R. Curtis, which was handed over to France. The ship was renamed SS Grand Camp after a Normandy beach and pressed into service, hauling diverse cargoes. By 1947, the vessel had already carried munitions from Belgium, taken on rope in Cuba and Houston, and now steamed into Texas City to load its next consignment. That April, dock workers began stowing a staggering 2,300,000 kilograms of ammonium nitrate into her holds. Common cargo in the 1940s, the chemical was both an ingredient in wartime explosives and, in peacetime, a widely used fertilizer. The bags were stacked alongside rope, peanuts, tobacco, and cotton. Longshoremen noted that the sacks of fertilizer felt unusually warm, but few gave it any concern. At roughly 8 o'clock on the morning of April 16th, workers spotted smoke seeping from the ship's hold. They discovered a small fire and tried to extinguish it with a single gallon of water. When that failed, 2 fire extinguishers were deployed, but the flames persisted, smoke filling the hold until the captain ordered an evacuation. Fearing that water would ruin the cargo, the captain refused to allow more conventional firefighting. Instead, the hatches were sealed, and steam was pumped inside in an attempt to smother the blaze. Texas City's volunteer fire department assisted, applying what was then a standard maritime technique. But in this case, the added heat may have triggered the decomposition of ammonium nitrate into nitrogen oxides, a reaction that produced even more heat and pressure in the confined space. By 8:30, the buildup was so great that several hatches were blown skyward, releasing a towering plume of orange smoke. The strange sound and color could be seen across the bay, drawing crowds of onlookers to the waterfront. Believing themselves to be at a safe distance, they stood transfixed. In truth, few of them were safe at all. At precisely 9:12 that morning, the volatile mix of heat and pressure detonated the ship's entire load. The blast obliterated nearly everything within 600 meters, flattening close to 1,000 buildings. Shockwaves rippled outward for 400 kilometers, shattering windows throughout Galveston and even knocking 2 aircraft from the sky. Every ounce of cargo aboard the Grand Camp was hurled into the air at supersonic speed. Burning coils of rope and shards of wreckage rained down across the harbor, sparking fresh fires and devastation. The ship's anchor was later discovered in a crater near the Texas City Rail Depot, 2.5 kilometers from where the vessel had been moored. Some blazes along the waterfront were doused by a tidal wave 2 stories high, itself generated by the explosion. Even so, enough fires continued to smolder that rescuers could not approach the docks to combat the flames, consuming what remained of the SS Grand Camp. The blast had also snapped the moorings of the nearby SS High Flyer, sending it adrift across the harbor. At first, the crew stayed aboard, but as the smoke thickened, they abandoned the vessel. Hours later, 2 sailors returned to search for survivors and discovered that the High Flyer's cargo, which also included ammonium nitrate, had ignited. Beginning at 11 o'clock that night, efforts were made to tow the ship away from the pier. By 1 in the morning, the attempt was abandoned. The vessel simply would not budge. 12 hours later, the High Flyer exploded in much the same manner as the Grand Camp. Once again, flaming debris and twisted steel rained down upon a city still reeling from the previous day's catastrophe. It is estimated that the first blast alone killed 567 people, including all 40 crewmen of the Grand Camp, every firefighter on scene save one, and hundreds of curious onlookers. The force was such that 63 victims were never identified. The second explosion, equally violent, claimed only 2 more lives, most of the area having already been evacuated. The true toll of the disaster can only be guessed. With undocumented laborers and transient visitors present at the port, many of the dead were likely never counted. More than 5,000 were injured, 1,784 of them hospitalized. 500 homes were destroyed, leaving 2,000 residents homeless. Property damage was estimated at $100 million, more than $1 billion in today's terms, without even accounting for the vast reserves of oil consumed in the fires. The entire nation reeled. Donations poured in, bolstered by benefit concerts featuring the stars of the era, including Frank Sinatra. More than $1 million was raised privately, with an additional $4 million covered by insurers. Yet these sums fell far short of the $100 million in losses. In desperation, 1,394 survivors filed a class action lawsuit against the United States government, alleging negligence in the manufacture, packaging, and labeling of the ammonium nitrate that had fueled the calamity. A district court initially ruled in their favor, but the decision was overturned by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court upheld that reversal. The ruling stirred deep controversy. Had a private citizen caused such destruction, they would have been held liable. That the government was not bound by the same standard was a bitter pill for many. Even so, Congress passed a relief act for the victims. By 1957, when the final payments were made, nearly $17 million had been distributed to the 1,394 claimants. Major companies that had lost plants in the disaster pledged to rebuild, and most did, some even expanding operations and re-employing longshoremen to take part in reconstruction. Today, Texas City ranks as the 14th busiest port in the United States, handling more than $10 billion in international trade annually. Within the city, Memorial Park holds the remains of 63 unidentified victims. Nearby stands the Grand Camp's anchor, hurled across the city by the blast and preserved as a lasting monument to those lost in the April 1947 disaster. Number 7. The Doodlebug Disaster. On July 31, 1940, a gasoline-powered passenger rail car, commonly known as a doodlebug, departed on its routine run between Hudson and Akron, Ohio, carrying 46 people on board. Only 3 of them would ever reach their destination. The remaining 43 perished in what became the deadliest rail accident in the state in nearly 70 years. Gasoline-powered rail cars were self-propelled coaches designed to carry either passengers or freight. Unlike electrified systems drawing current from overhead wires or third rails, these units relied on internal combustion engines fueled by gasoline. They gained popularity in the United States during the early 20th century, especially on lightly traveled branch lines. On such routes, operating costs for doodlebugs were far lower than those of a full train. They required less power and could be staffed by a minimal crew. Most were built with control cabs at both ends, allowing them to reverse direction quickly. Occasionally, they pulled an extra trailer, but more often they ran alone. The public soon dubbed them doodlebugs, both for their beetle-like appearance and for their sluggish pace compared to electric trains, as though crawling along the rails. Early models were gasoline-driven, and the largest manufacturer was the Pullman Company. On the Akron-Hudson line, operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad, doodlebugs were in regular use. This route was a segment of a longer corridor stretching more than 228 kilometers from Columbus to Hudson. Around Akron, much of the track was double-tracked, but in certain places it narrowed to a single line. At those points, careful traffic control was required to prevent opposing trains from entering simultaneously. Sometimes instructions were delivered in writing to the crews, and in other cases, manned signal stations controlled the flow. The 21-kilometer run between Akron and Hudson mainly served daily commuters. Many passengers arrived from Cleveland and Pittsburgh into Hudson, then boarded the Doodlebug to complete the final leg into Akron. On July 31, 1940, the engineer assigned to one such Doodlebug was Thomas L. Murtaugh. Though new to this equipment, he was no novice. He brought with him 30 years of railroad experience. Accompanying him was conductor Harry B. Schaefer, 57, temporarily filling in for a colleague on a 10-day leave. Also aboard was 24-year-old railroad employee Todd One, traveling as a passenger on his way back to Akron after completing work in Hudson. That evening, after returning northbound from Akron, the Doodlebug reached Hudson Station, where orders awaited. A freight train was scheduled to move in the opposite direction over the same track. Accordingly, the Doodlebug was instructed to hold at switch number 1 near Silver Lake until the freight had passed. The freight had departed Columbus for Cleveland, hauling 73 loaded cars. It stopped at Arlington, within Akron, where its crew received written orders detailing how to safely avoid the Doodlebug. On the Doodlebug's end, it was conductor Schaefer who accepted the order at Hudson. He handed it directly to engineer Murtaugh, later recalling that he remarked aloud, "We'll meet at switch number 1, Silver Lake." Murtaugh nodded his agreement and read the order carefully. At 5:49 p.m., the Doodlebug departed Hudson. Almost the very moment the freight train pulled out of Akron. Through the early part of the trip, Schaefer moved through the car collecting tickets, later retiring to the smoking compartment to catch up on paperwork. When finished, he glanced at his watch and realized the Doodlebug was already a few seconds past the point where it should have stopped at Silver Lake. Alarmed, he hurried forward toward the cab to alert Murtaugh, but before he could reach the front, the freight loomed directly ahead on the single track. At that same instant, engineer Murtaugh spotted it and threw the brakes into emergency. The freight's engineer did the same, blasting the whistle. Conductor Schaefer, standing near railroad worker Todd One, shouted that a collision was imminent. Both men leapt from the Doodlebug, realizing that a collision was inevitable. Murtaugh hurled himself out of the cab. At 5:58 p.m., near Cuyahoga Falls, the freight slammed head-on into the Doodlebug, crushing the forward cab and driving 3.6 meters into the passenger compartment. The impact ruptured the Doodlebug's fuel tank, spilling gasoline that ignited into a raging inferno. Flames spread to the freight consist as well, burning the face of its engineer. Still moving forward, the freight pushed the Doodlebug back nearly 150 meters along the track. Local residents rushed to help, but were driven back by heat and smoke too intense to approach. It took hours to recover the bodies, many fused to their seats by the searing blaze. Every seat had been ripped from its moorings, jammed in a heap at the rear of the car. Some passengers were so badly charred they were almost unrecognizable. All 43 passengers aboard the Doodlebug perished. Engineer Murtaugh was found roughly 300 meters from the wreck, suffering a fractured skull and delirium. Conductor Harry Schaefer survived but lost his right hand and leg to amputation. Railroad worker Todd One escaped with only a sprained ankle and minor burns. His roommate, however, had been among those trapped inside and was killed. Within 24 hours, the Pennsylvania Railroad's vice president issued a statement, placing blame on the crew for failing to obey orders. But not all accepted that conclusion. The Railroad Workers Union countered that 3 signalmen had once been stationed along the Hudson-Akron route, only to be cut for cost savings. 3 separate investigations were launched, but all were delayed as engineer Thomas Murtaugh took months to recover. During his hospitalization, he lapsed into paranoia, repeatedly muttering, "Get me out of here. I have to get back to work." Investigators seized the written order given to the Doodlebug, which clearly instructed it to wait at switch number 1. There was no doubt the order had been received. So why did Murtaugh not stop? When finally able to testify, he admitted he had received and understood the order, but could not recall the moments leading up to the crash. His memory was blank until the sight of the freight bearing down upon him. It emerged that Murtaugh had been plagued by headaches and loss of appetite while running the Doodlebug, losing 6.8 kilograms since taking the assignment. This fueled speculation that he had suffered carbon monoxide poisoning from gasoline fumes in the cab, impairing his judgment. Ultimately, no charges were filed against the crew or the company. Families of the victims sued the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the case was settled out of court for nearly $600,000. In the aftermath, new signal systems and interlocking safeguards were installed around Silver Lake, and all gasoline-powered Doodlebugs were replaced with less flammable diesel engines. Exactly 11 years later, on July 31, 1951, the final Doodlebug made its run from Hudson to Akron before the line was permanently discontinued. From then on, gasoline engines in rail service declined steadily, though diesel locomotives remained common worldwide. Once a shock to the nation, the Doodlebug tragedy faded gradually from memory. In 2005, a class of 13-year-old students at Sill Middle School launched a campaign to build a memorial. The monument was erected near the crash site, unveiled on the 65th anniversary of the disaster. Number 8. The Rana Plaza Collapse. On April 24, 2013, garment workers reported for duty at several factories housed inside Rana Plaza, an 8-story building in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Many arrived uneasy, and with good reason. The day before, large cracks had been discovered in the lower floors, prompting an evacuation. Yet that morning they were reassured the structure was safe, a claim that could not have been further from the truth. Textiles are a cornerstone of Bangladesh's economy, accounting for nearly 3/4 of the nation's exports. Millions are employed in garment factories across the country, many of them women and young girls. The work is grueling and the wages low, but for countless families it is the only means of survival. Rana Plaza had been constructed in 2006, built atop a filled-in pond. Initially 5 stories tall, it was owned by Sohel Rana, a businessman who grew increasingly entangled in local politics. Leveraging his political connections, he secured a permit for 1 additional floor. But then, without further approval, he illegally added 3 more, nearly doubling the original height. By 2013, yet another 9th floor was under construction, transforming the complex into a hulking tower. Although designed as a commercial building, Rana Plaza's lower levels were leased to shops and a bank. The upper floors, however, were packed with garment factories, employing roughly 5,000 workers to churn out clothing for global brands. The day before the disaster, a local television crew filmed inside, capturing footage of gaping cracks in the walls. Alarms were raised, and the building was evacuated to await engineering inspections. Bank employees and shopkeepers were told to stay home the following day for their safety. But factory workers were given a very different message. They were ordered to report as usual. They were assured the fissures were only surface plaster flaking, purely cosmetic. The owner himself personally told factory managers there was no cause for concern. Some workers had long doubted the building's integrity. Veterans of the factory floor noted how the structure trembled whenever the rooftop generators roared to life. Their fears only grew, but the pressure to work was immense. For most, this was their sole livelihood. Managers in some factories threatened dismissal or a month's lost wages if they stayed away. And so, on the morning of April 24th, nearly all 5,000 workers filed inside to begin another day. At about 8:45 a.m., the power failed. Diesel generators on the roof were switched on, sending vibrations through the tower as they always had. But this time, the tremors were followed by thunderous cracks and violent jolts. Workers bolted toward stairwells, but few escaped before the unthinkable happened. The rear of the building gave way, and 8 floors pancaked downward in an instant. The collapse pulled down an adjoining 3-story structure as well. Local residents and passers-by were the first to scramble into the dust and rubble, digging with their hands for survivors. Hours later, the Bangladeshi army and rescue forces arrived, beginning an operation that would last for days. International search and rescue specialists offered aid, but the Bangladeshi government declined, insisting domestic teams were sufficient. A tragedy unfolded when sparks from cutting equipment ignited fabric buried in the wreckage, Fire ripped through voids where survivors still lay trapped. Rescuers were forced to retreat for hours. 4 firefighters were injured, and 1 survivor, who had been within reach, was lost to the flames. Despite the setbacks, rescue efforts pressed on under local command. Survivors were pulled out for days, but alongside them came body after body. In total, 1,134 lives were lost, and more than 2,500 were injured, many grievously. Subsequent investigations revealed a cascade of failures. The building had been raised on soft, reclaimed soil. Unauthorized floors were added without reinforcement. Heavy machinery had been crammed into a structure designed for commercial shops, not industrial load, creating chronic stresses and vibrations that slowly undermined its frame. Because the illegal expansions were never submitted for approval, none of these flaws were caught by regulators. Further revelations were damning: pitifully low wages, brutal working conditions, and relentless pressure from well-known international brands demanding rapid output. These pressures forced thousands back into a visibly dangerous factory until the walls, the machines, and the lives inside came crashing down. Roughly 30 global corporations had once sourced garments from Rana Plaza, yet only 7 ultimately agreed to contribute to the Victim Compensation Fund. The distribution of those payments ignited unrest in the days that followed. Some survivors received nothing at all, while others were given sums so meager they scarcely covered their losses. This despite the fact that many had lost entire families in the collapse. Certain companies even demanded DNA testing to prove kinship with the dead before releasing compensation. Garment workers organized protest after protest, and on occasion those demonstrations turned violent. At times, police fired warning shots into the air to scatter crowds. In other instances, rubber bullets and tear gas were deployed. Amid efforts to control the chaos, authorities launched a manhunt for Sohail Rana, the building's owner. Within days, he was captured near the Indian border, apparently attempting to flee the country, and flown back to Dhaka under armed guard. Public fury was so intense that he was forced to wear a helmet and bulletproof vest during his first court appearances. Few doubted his responsibility. It was he who had erected the tower without permits, he who had assured managers and workers of its safety even after cracks split its walls, and he who had built Rana Plaza atop reclaimed swamp ground in the first place. Convicted of corruption, Rana was sentenced to years in prison, and even after serving that term he was not released. Police continued to press new charges, and as of 2022 he remained behind bars, his worst-case outcome still a potential death sentence. The site where Rana Plaza once stood has since been cleared, but remains, to this day, nothing more than an empty lot. Number 9. The Curse of the Orang Medan. In 1947, a vessel was discovered adrift in the Indian Ocean. Her entire crew was dead, and yet the ship itself bore no damage, while none of the bodies showed any sign of physical injury. How then had they perished? This is the enduring mystery of the SS Orang Medan. The Strait of Malacca, lying between Malaysia and the island of Sumatra, is one of the busiest and most important maritime corridors in the world, linking major economies such as China, India, and Japan. Each day, some 260 vessels pass through its waters, carrying roughly 1/4 of the world's traded goods. At the narrow Phillips Channel, the strait pinches to little more than 1.5 miles across, rendering passage impossible for the largest ships afloat. Perhaps that is a blessing in disguise, for there is another reason this stretch of sea has earned its sinister reputation. Over the past century, more than 30 ships have vanished there, an average of 1 every 3 to 4 years. Among these, the fate of the Orang Medan proved so chilling that it unsettled mariners for decades. In June of 1947, according to the tale, vessels transiting the Strait of Malacca began to receive a strange SOS, tapped out in Morse code from an unidentified source. The message came in 2 parts, giving neither the vessel's name nor her position, but hinting at a dreadful scene. It read, "All officers, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and on the bridge, possibly whole crew dead." Moments later, a final message crackled through, brief and haunting, "I die." Then there was silence. Authorities immediately scrambled to locate the phantom ship. All vessels in the region were alerted and instructed to keep a sharp watch for any anomaly. At first, the search proved fruitless, but thanks to the efforts of British and Dutch listening stations, the origin of the signal was finally traced, far out in the Indian Ocean, away from the main shipping lanes. As chance would have it, the nearest vessel was an American merchant ship named the Silver Star. Informed of the SOS content, her captain altered course at once, and within hours the shadow of another vessel appeared on the horizon. It was the SS Orang Medan. She was drifting, without steam, without command, a lifeless hulk on the open sea. Repeated attempts to hail her went unanswered. No sign of life stirred on deck, and it soon became obvious that something terrible had occurred. Drawing alongside, the Silver Star secured lines and prepared a boarding party. An anxious silence hung over the rescue crew as they crossed. The moment they set foot aboard, their worst fears were realized. The deck was littered with Dutch sailors, every corpse frozen in grotesque posture. Eyes stared wide in terror, faces twisted in fear, limbs locked as if fending off some invisible assailant. Even the ship's dog lay dead, teeth bared in a final snarl. Searching the interior, they found the captain slumped on the bridge, his officers sprawled in the chart room and wheelhouse, engineers at their stations. The radio operator collapsed at his set. Every face bore the same mask of horror. Clearly, the entire crew had died in the grip of unimaginable fear, and yet the cause remained wholly inexplicable. The ship bore no damage, and though her crew had perished in abject terror, none showed the slightest wound. The men of the Silver Star recorded another disturbing anomaly. Although the summer day outside blazed at more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of the Orang Medan was strangely frigid. One compartment measured scarcely 40 degrees. Despite these mysteries, the captain of the Silver Star resolved to take the derelict in tow. But no sooner had the two ships been lashed together than smoke began to pour from hold number 4. Hastily, the Silver Star's crew severed the tow line, only seconds before the Orang Medan erupted in a violent explosion, lifting from the sea before shattering into pieces and vanishing beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean, never to be seen again. Fortunately, no one aboard the Silver Star was harmed, and it was equally fortunate that no one remained on the doomed vessel when it exploded. Had the blast occurred while the two ships were still lashed together, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Thanks to the vigilance and swift action of the Silver Star's crew, we have what little evidence survives of this extraordinary and chilling event. The story was first formally recorded in May of 1952 by the United States Coast Guard, and ever since, speculation has persisted over what truly befell the crew of that ill-fated ship. Inevitably, comparisons have been drawn with the so-called Philadelphia experiment, and some theorists have even suggested that the Orang Medan was part of a failed government project. Others believe the vessel fell victim to supernatural forces, and, of course, there are those who remain skeptical, questioning whether the ship ever existed at all. One intriguing detail emerged when investigators noted that the name Orang Medan does not appear in any maritime registry, nor was it ever formally recorded at any port of call. Yet there may be a rational explanation. In 1954, a German author named Otto Mielke published a study of the incident, claiming to have drawn upon information from members of the Silver Star's crew. His account introduced previously unknown details, including the ship's last reported position and her intended voyage. Most significantly, Mielke referred to the cargo she carried, suggesting that the Orang Medan may have been transporting hazardous materials improperly stored, such as potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin. If true, the authorities would have considered this an egregious act of negligence, and no ship carrying such a cargo would ever have been permitted to sail. This has led some to believe the Orang Medan was engaged in smuggling. That theory would also explain why the vessel was so far off established shipping lanes. According to this hypothesis, seawater may have entered the hold, reacting with the potassium cyanide to release toxic fumes that asphyxiated the crew. Later, further contact with nitroglycerin could have triggered a fire, culminating in the catastrophic explosion. Yet even this fails to answer all questions. Why was no one in the boarding party affected by cyanide fumes, which should have lingered at lethal concentrations when they arrived? Furthermore, cyanide causes a swift but not agonizing death. So, why were the bodies of the sailors contorted in postures of fear and suffering? Other researchers have suggested that the ship was not carrying potassium cyanide at all, but rather a far deadlier substance known as taboon. Taboon was a powerful nerve agent produced in large quantities by Nazi Germany during the Second World War and later transferred to their Japanese allies. When the Axis powers collapsed, the Western Allies scrambled to recruit defecting German scientists and to seize the remnants of their wartime stockpiles, including taboon. At the time, the United States was aggressively pursuing chemical weapons research, and it is not impossible that a significant quantity of the substance had fallen into American hands via Japan. To avoid any traceable records, it may have been loaded aboard an anonymous cargo ship, staffed with a foreign crew to provide further distance. Crucially, Tabun is known to degrade quickly, meaning that by the time the Silver Star's men boarded, the toxic cloud would have dissipated entirely. More disturbingly, Tabun interferes with the neurotransmitters that control muscle relaxation, forcing the body into violent spasms, an explanation, perhaps, for the sailors' grotesquely twisted forms. To this day, the story of the Orang Medan cannot be proven, nor can it be fully dismissed. It may indeed be nothing more than a seafarer's legend spun from rumor and imagination, yet the fact that the United States Coast Guard once officially referenced the case lends it a measure of weight. Moreover, the dedication of researchers who have spent more than half a century attempting to unravel the mystery suggests that there may be more to this tale than a simple fabrication. Number 10. The Flannan Isle Lighthouse Mystery. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on a remote cluster of islands in the North Atlantic vanished without a trace. Was their disappearance the result of some sudden accident? Or was there something darker and more mysterious at work? This is the enduring enigma of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. On the evening of December 7, 1900, Robert Muirhead, a superintendent for the Northern Lighthouse Board, descended the eastern landing of Eilean Moor and stepped into the small boat waiting for him. After shaking hands and bidding farewell to his 3 colleagues, he made for the larger steamer anchored offshore, which would take him back to the mainland. He glanced back at the 3 men he had just left behind on that lonely rock, Donald MacArthur, Thomas Marshall, and James Ducat, who stood at the landing waving to him, while he raised his hand in return. He could not have known that he would be the last person ever to see them alive, for when the relief vessel returned 19 days later, all 3 had vanished without a trace. The Flannan Isles, a group of 7 small islets lying some 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides off Scotland's western coast, form the stage for this unsettling mystery. What lends the tale its chilling edge is the sheer isolation of the 3 men, stationed on the ragged edge of civilization, surrounded on all sides by the vast and merciless Atlantic. The Isles take their name from Saint Flannan, an Irish monk of the 7th century, and they have never been permanently inhabited. Local communities in the Outer Hebrides have long regarded them with a kind of wary awe. Over the years, fishing boats and merchant vessels alike have met with disaster in the waters around them. From time to time, sheep were brought across to graze on their sparse grass, but no one ever considered spending the night there. In the 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board resolved to build a lighthouse on Eilean Moor, the largest of the 7. Construction dragged on for 4 years, hindered constantly by the fury of the Atlantic waves, which made transporting materials an ordeal. Nevertheless, the structure was finally completed and brought into service on December 7, 1899. The lighthouse had no radio system. Its only link with the mainland was semaphore signaling, which could sometimes be seen from the Hebrides on clear days. It was staffed by no more than 3 men at a time, with a 4th ashore on leave. The mystery began on the night of December 15, 1900, when a sudden storm swept across the waters around the island. The first sign that something was amiss came from the captain of an American steamer, the SS Archtor, en route from Philadelphia to the port of Leith at Edinburgh. Passing Eilean Moor just before midnight, he noted with surprise that the lighthouse stood in darkness, an almost unprecedented sight for an active offshore station such as Flannan. When the Archtor docked in Leith a few hours later, the matter was reported, but fierce weather prevented the board from taking immediate action. The relief vessel Hesperus had been scheduled to depart on the 20th, but owing to the adverse conditions, it was not until the morning of December 26th that she finally set out, carrying fresh supplies and the replacement keeper, Joseph Moore. As the ship drew close to the eastern landing, Captain Jim Harvey of the Hesperus sounded 3 long blasts on the steam whistle and fired a signal rocket. There was no reply. From that moment, an uneasy sense settled over the crew. No one came out to greet them. No supply boxes had been left ready for exchange, and the flagpole stood bare. The Hesperus dropped anchor in silence while Joseph Moore went ashore alone. Climbing the steep path from the eastern landing toward the lighthouse, he called out the names of his 3 colleagues, but there was no answer. The gate and the main door were both closed, yet inside, everything appeared strangely normal. The lamp had been cleaned and refilled with oil, The beds were unmade, as though the men had only just risen. Dishes had been washed. In the hearth, ashes still lingered, cold and gray. But then Moore noticed a chair overturned in the kitchen, and, more ominously, that every clock in the station had stopped. Returning to report to his captain, Moore then led a search party of sailors back into the lighthouse. On the eastern side, all was as it should be. But the western landing told a different story. There, storm damage was everywhere. A storage box, set more than 100 feet above sea level, had been smashed open, its contents strewn across the ground. Iron railings had been twisted, the stone walkway rails torn from their concrete. A boulder weighing more than a ton had been shifted from its place, and atop the cliffs, some 200 feet above the waves, the grass had been ripped back as much as 30 feet from the edge. Subsequent investigation revealed that the men had continued making log entries until 9 o'clock on the morning of December 15th, and these notes confirmed that the storm damage had occurred before their disappearance. Another crucial clue lay in the fact that 2 sets of oilskins were missing, while a third still hung by the door. This implied that one of the 3 had gone outside without his protective gear, a decision almost inconceivable given the brutal winter weather recorded that day in the North Atlantic. As for the keepers themselves, no trace was ever found, neither within the lighthouse nor anywhere else on the island. It was as though they had simply vanished. Joseph Moore, together with 3 sailors who volunteered to remain behind, assumed responsibility for running the light, while the Hesperus returned to the Braesclete station. From there, Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board on December 26, 1900, which read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks have all stopped, and other signs indicate that the accident must have occurred about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned while trying to secure a crane or some other apparatus." The mystery of the Flannan Isles has since become an endless source of speculation, inspiring countless retellings and even an opera. Yet the full truth of the disappearance will likely never be known. Over the years, embellishments have crept into the tale. It was once claimed, for example, that Joseph Moore found a half-eaten meal left upon the table, a detail common to tales of eerie vanishments, but in fact no such thing was recorded. Likewise, rumors of log entries describing the men's panic or irritability proved to be fabrications. The surviving journal notes only storm damage at the western landing and a few minor comments on the weather. There was no mention of Ducat weeping or Marshall losing his temper. Those dramatic touches were later inventions of a pulp magazine in America, seeking to heighten the sense of the macabre. Still, no bodies were ever recovered, nor did any further evidence emerge. We are left only to speculate about what transpired on that desolate rock in the bleak December of the new century. Some have suggested that one keeper murdered the other 2 before throwing himself into the sea in remorse. Others whisper that a sea monster rose suddenly from the depths as they stood upon the western landing and carried all 3 away, or that foreign agents abducted them. There are stories, too, of a ghostly vessel, laden with spirits, seen drifting toward the isle on that same night. Locally, tales of the Phantom of Flannan had circulated long before, and in the latter half of the 20th century, even theories of alien abduction were put forward. Yet the simplest explanation is often the most convincing. The official conclusion of the Northern Lighthouse Board was that the 3 men had been swept away by an unexpected wave. Perhaps Thomas Marshall and James Ducat had gone to the western landing to secure damaged equipment, while Donald MacArthur remained within the lighthouse, as regulations required that the station never be left completely unattended. From his vantage point, MacArthur may have seen a massive wave bearing down upon his comrades and rushed outside to warn them. But he arrived too late, and all 3 were swept into the sea. This would account for the overturned chair, the single oilskin left behind, and why all 3 men were outside together. Yet if MacArthur had departed in haste, why was the lighthouse door shut and the gate locked? And how could 3 seasoned mariners, who had spent their lives upon the sea, be caught so unawares by a wave? If this explanation is correct, why did no bodies ever wash ashore, as they so often do in those waters? It seems that many questions remain unanswered, and the truth may be stranger than we dare to imagine. Whatever the case, the lighthouse remained staffed and operational until 1971, when it was fully automated. To this day, the light still shines, visited only occasionally by those charged with its maintenance. If you found this tale haunting, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. 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 Won't miss the